Lam Son 719, the invasion of Laos that went wrong. In February 1971, thousands of South Vietnamese soldiers crossed the border into Laos. Their mission sounded simple: drive west along Route 9, smash North Vietnam's supply bases, cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail, reach the town of Chaponi, then get out before the enemy could react. The United States would provide overwhelming air power. B-52 bombers would strike enemy concentrations. Fighter bombers would attack roads, artillery positions, and supply depots. Hundreds of American helicopters would carry South Vietnamese troops into battle. But there was one critical restriction: American ground troops could not cross into Laos. For President Richard Nixon, this was supposed to demonstrate that Vietnamization was working. South Vietnam would prove that its army could increasingly fight the war without American combat troops beside it. Instead, Lam Son 79 became one of the most controversial operations of the Vietnam War. Within weeks, elite South Vietnamese units were fighting for survival. Firebases were surrounded. Helicopters flew into walls of anti-aircraft fire. Tanks were abandoned. Soldiers fought desperately for seats aboard evacuation aircraft. And images of South Vietnamese troops clinging to helicopters became symbols of an operation that had gone badly wrong. So what happened? How did an offensive backed by enormous American air power turn into such a dangerous retreat? And what did Lam Son 719 reveal about the future of the Vietnam War? By late 1970, the United States faced a strategic problem. President Nixon was withdrawing American troops from Vietnam. His policy of Vietnamization was designed to transfer more responsibility for the fighting to the armed forces of South Vietnam. But North Vietnam still possessed a massive advantage: the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was not a single jungle road. It was an enormous logistical network running through Laos and Cambodia. Trucks, soldiers, ammunition, fuel, food, and weapons moved south through this system. American aircraft had bombed the trail for years. Sensors had been dropped into the jungle. Roads had been cratered repeatedly. Trucks had been hunted at night. Yet the network survived. The North Vietnamese repaired roads, constructed bypasses, concealed vehicles beneath the jungle canopy, and continuously expanded the system. American commanders began considering something far more direct. Instead of bombing the trail from the air, why not send ground troops into Laos and attack its major logistical bases? General Creighton Abrams, commander of American forces in Vietnam, supported an offensive toward Chaponi. Chapon was strategically important because several branches of the Ho Chi Minh Trail passed through the region. If South Vietnamese forces could enter Laos, destroy supply depots, disrupt transportation routes, and force North Vietnamese units into battle, the offensive might buy South Vietnam valuable time. There was also a political objective. Washington needed evidence that Vietnamization was succeeding. American troop numbers were falling. If the Army of the Republic of Vietnam could conduct a major offensive largely on its own, Nixon could argue that his withdrawal strategy was working. But American law created a major complication. After the expansion of the war into Cambodia in 1970, Congress had placed restrictions on the use of American ground forces in Laos and Cambodia. American soldiers could secure the South Vietnamese side of the border. American aircraft could provide enormous firepower. American helicopters could operate over Laos. But American ground combat units and advisors could not accompany the South Vietnamese troops across the border. This created an unusual command structure. The South Vietnamese would fight the ground battle. The Americans would provide much of the firepower, aviation, intelligence, and logistical support. The first stage began on January 30th, 1971. American forces launched Operation Dewey Canyon 2. They reopened the former combat base at Khe Sanh and secured Route 9 leading toward the Laotian border. Then, on February 8th, South Vietnamese forces crossed into Laos. Operation Lam Son 719 had begun. The name Lam Son honored the birthplace associated with Le Loi, the Vietnamese leader who had fought Chinese occupation in the 15th century. The number 719 combined the year 1971 with Route 9, the main road through the operational area. On paper, the attacking force was formidable. South Vietnam committed some of its best formations: airborne troops, rangers, marines, infantry, armor, artillery. The main armored column would advance west along Route 9 toward Chaponi. Other units would establish fire bases and landing zones north and south of the highway. These positions would protect the flanks and provide artillery support. American helicopters would move troops between them. American aircraft would strike North Vietnamese forces before they could organize effective resistance. The plan depended heavily on speed, but speed disappeared almost immediately. Route 9 was far worse than planners hoped. Years of war and bombing had damaged it severely. Craters, streams, broken bridges, dense jungle, and steep terrain slowed armored vehicles. Instead of racing toward Chapon, the main column began to crawl. South Vietnamese troops advanced roughly 10 miles into Laos and then stopped around the area of A Luoi. This pause became one of the decisive moments of the operation. Every day that the advance slowed gave North Vietnam more time, and North Vietnam was not going to abandon the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Hanoi understood exactly what was at stake. The trail was the logistical lifeline connecting North Vietnam with its forces farther south. Losing the Chapon region, even temporarily, could disrupt preparations for future operations. So the People's Army of Vietnam responded aggressively. North Vietnamese reinforcements poured toward the battlefield. Infantry arrived. Artillery arrived. Tanks arrived. Anti-aircraft weapons were concentrated around landing zones and helicopter routes. The battle that Allied planners had hoped might be a rapid raid was becoming something very different. A major conventional battle. American and South Vietnamese commanders had expected resistance. What they had underestimated was the speed and scale of the response. By the time South Vietnamese troops entered Laos, North Vietnamese forces were already concentrating heavily in the region. Eventually, several divisions would become involved. The terrain also worked in their favor. South Vietnamese units were distributed among isolated firebases and landing zones. These positions depended on helicopters for reinforcement, ammunition, food, medical evacuation, and sometimes survival itself. North Vietnamese commanders recognized the weakness. Instead of simply defending the supply depots, they began attacking the isolated positions. One of the first major warning signs came around Ranger Base North. South Vietnamese Rangers found themselves under increasingly heavy pressure. North Vietnamese forces used artillery, mortars, infantry assaults, and anti-aircraft weapons. The defenders fought hard. American aircraft struck surrounding enemy positions. But the pressure continued. Helicopters attempting to resupply or evacuate troops had to fly into intense ground fire. Eventually, the position became untenable. Other fire bases suffered similar attacks. This was exactly the kind of battle North Vietnam wanted. The South Vietnamese forces were operating far from their normal logistical network. Their units were separated. Their supply depended heavily on aviation. And because American advisors were prohibited from accompanying them into Laos, coordination between South Vietnamese troops and American airpower became more difficult. The helicopter became both the greatest strength and one of the greatest vulnerabilities of Lam Son 719. American aviation units performed extraordinary missions during the operation. Pilots repeatedly entered heavily defended landing zones. Some helicopters returned riddled with bullets. Others never returned. North Vietnamese anti-aircraft defenses were much heavier than those encountered during many earlier helicopter operations. Machine guns and automatic weapons covered likely flight paths. Larger anti-aircraft guns threatened helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft. Every landing zone could become an ambush. American Army records later reported dozens of helicopters destroyed and hundreds damaged during the campaign. At times, the number of aircraft actually available became dangerously low. Yet without those helicopters, many South Vietnamese positions could not have survived at all. Meanwhile, the advance toward Chaponi had nearly stopped. This created a political problem. Chapon had become the symbol of the offensive. If South Vietnamese troops never reached it, Lam Son 79 could easily appear to have failed. By early March, a decision was made to seize the town by helicopter rather than continue waiting for the slow ground advance. American bombers and tactical aircraft heavily attacked the area. Then South Vietnamese infantry was lifted into positions near Chapon. On March 6th, troops entered the abandoned town. Militarily, Chapon itself was not particularly valuable. North Vietnam had already moved much of its logistical activity away from the immediate area. But politically, reaching Chapon allowed Saigon to claim that the planned objective had been achieved. President Nguyen Van Thieu publicly celebrated the operation, but the troops did not stay. After only a few days, the withdrawal began, and this was when Lam Son 79 entered its most dangerous phase. Retreating while under enemy pressure is one of the most difficult operations any army can conduct. South Vietnamese forces now had to pull eastward while North Vietnamese troops were trying to surround and destroy them. The enemy had tanks, artillery, anti-aircraft weapons, and growing numerical strength. North Vietnamese units attacked firebases and escape routes. Artillery struck South Vietnamese positions. Tanks pushed toward withdrawing formations. The battlefield became increasingly chaotic. Some South Vietnamese units conducted disciplined withdrawals. Others suffered severe losses. Equipment that could not be moved quickly was destroyed or abandoned. Artillery pieces were left behind. Armored vehicles were lost. Trucks and supplies were abandoned along Route 9. American airpower now became essential, not for supporting an advance, but for preventing the withdrawal from becoming a complete catastrophe. Tactical fighters attacked pursuing forces. B-52 bombers struck troop concentrations. Attack helicopters fought North Vietnamese armor. Transport helicopters entered exposed landing zones to extract South Vietnamese soldiers. Some of the most dramatic images of Lam Son 719 came during these evacuations. Soldiers crowded around helicopters. Men grabbed landing skids as aircraft lifted away. For television audiences, these images were devastating. The Nixon administration argued that the pictures did not represent the whole operation, and technically, that was true. Many South Vietnamese units had fought extremely hard. North Vietnamese forces suffered serious casualties. Large quantities of equipment and supplies were destroyed. Hanoi had been forced to divert major combat formations to defend the trail. American commanders later argued that the offensive delayed North Vietnamese operations and temporarily disrupted logistics. But those claims could not erase the central problem. The Ho Chi Minh Trail had not been permanently cut. The North Vietnamese logistical system survived, and the troops that entered Laos eventually had to fight their way back out. By March 24th, the last major South Vietnamese forces had crossed back into South Vietnam. Lam Son 719 was formally terminated in early April. The cost was severe. American military histories estimate that roughly 17,000 South Vietnamese troops were committed to the operation. More than 1,700 were killed. More than 6,600 were wounded. Hundreds more were missing or captured. Large numbers of tanks, artillery pieces, vehicles, radios, weapons, and other equipment were lost. American forces also suffered hundreds of casualties supporting the operation, particularly among aviation units. North Vietnamese losses were also extremely heavy. Allied estimates claim more than 13,000 enemy dead and substantial losses in vehicles, weapons, and supplies. Those figures remain difficult to verify independently, and wartime body counts should always be treated cautiously. But there is little doubt that North Vietnamese forces paid a high price for defending the trail. This is why historians still debate exactly how Lam Son 719 should be judged. It was not a battle in which one side escaped without damage while the other was destroyed. North Vietnam suffered serious losses. The logistical network was disrupted. A potential major offensive in northern South Vietnam may have been delayed. But if the operation is judged by its larger political purpose, the result looks much worse. Lam Son 799 was supposed to demonstrate Vietnamization. Instead, it revealed how dependent South Vietnam remained on American support. RVN soldiers had entered Laos without American ground combat troops, but they had not fought without America. American helicopters moved them. American aircraft protected them. American B-52s attacked enemy positions. American logistical systems sustained the operation. American airpower helped keep the withdrawal from turning into an even greater disaster. That was the central contradiction. Vietnamization was supposed to create an independent South Vietnamese military capability. Lam Son 790 demonstrated that some South Vietnamese formations could fight extremely hard. But it also exposed serious weaknesses in command, coordination, logistics, communications, and combined arms warfare. The problem was not simply courage. Many ARVN soldiers displayed extraordinary courage during the campaign. The deeper problem was institutional. For years, South Vietnamese forces had fought inside a system built around enormous American support. American advisors often coordinated artillery and airstrikes. American helicopters provided mobility. American intelligence identified targets. American logistics supplied equipment. Removing American ground advisors while still expecting the same complex battlefield system to function created difficulties that courage alone could not solve. North Vietnam learned lessons too. Lam Son 719 showed Hanoi that its army could confront South Vietnamese elite formations in large conventional battles. It demonstrated the growing importance of tanks, artillery, anti-aircraft weapons, and coordinated divisional operations. 1 year later, in the spring of 1972, North Vietnam launched the Easter Offensive. This time, large armored and infantry formations crossed into South Vietnam itself. Once again, American airpower would become crucial to South Vietnam's survival. In that sense, Lam Son 719 was more than an isolated campaign in Laos. It was a preview of the war that was coming. The operation also demonstrated the limits of airpower. American aircraft could inflict enormous destruction. They could save surrounded units. They could destroy tanks. They could slow enemy movements. But they could not permanently occupy roads or destroy a logistical network that continually repaired and reorganized itself. The Ho Chi Minh Trail survived because it was not simply a road. It was a system designed around redundancy. Destroy one route and traffic shifted to another. Destroy a bridge and engineers built a bypass. Bomb a depot and supplies were dispersed. Attack during daylight and trucks moved at night. Lam Son 719 struck the system harder than many previous operations. But it could not destroy it. There was another lesson. The offensive demonstrated the danger of building military plans around political expectations. Washington wanted proof that Vietnamization worked. Saigon wanted to protect its elite formations from unacceptable losses. Commanders wanted to reach Chiponi because it had become a symbol of success. But the battlefield did not care about political symbolism. By the time South Vietnamese troops reached Chiponi, North Vietnam's logistical network had already adjusted. Holding an abandoned town for a few days did not mean controlling the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and declaring victory could not change what was happening along Route 9. The defining question of Lam Son 719, therefore, is not simply whether the South Vietnamese army won or lost. The more important question is whether the operation achieved enough to justify its enormous cost. American commanders argued that it killed large numbers of enemy troops, destroyed supplies, disrupted the trail, and postponed North Vietnamese plans. Critics argued that the operation exposed the weaknesses of Vietnamization, damaged some of South Vietnam's best units, and failed to achieve the decisive interruption of North Vietnamese logistics that planners had hoped for. Both sides could point to evidence, but history delivered a more powerful verdict. The Ho Chi Minh Trail remained operational. North Vietnam rebuilt its strength. 1 year later, its army launched one of the largest offensives of the entire war. And 4 years later, North Vietnamese tanks entered Saigon. Lam Son 719 did not determine that final outcome by itself. But for a few violent weeks in the mountains of Laos, it exposed a fundamental problem facing the United States and South Vietnam. America could withdraw its soldiers, but replacing the entire military system that had grown around them was far more difficult. Lam Son 719 was supposed to prove that South Vietnam was ready for the next stage of the war. Instead, it raised a far more troubling question. What would happen when American airpower was no longer there to save the situation? The answer would come sooner than anyone wanted.